Another day, another podcast, another manifesto. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where this time it's Labour's turn. Sir Keir Starmer and his shadow cabinet hot-footed it to Manchester, knowing that this election is theirs to lose. The word change was emblazoned on the lectern, the front of the manifesto, and anywhere you looked. But it could just as easily have been caution. For there was nothing new in terms of policy. Everything we'd heard before. Great British Energy, no tax rises for working people, a total change of direction, even if one protester managed to slip through security.
Our generation is being let down by the Labour Party and this manifesto. You say that you're offering change, but it's the same old Tory policy.
We gave up on being a party of protest 5 years ago. We want to be a party of power.
In 3 weeks' time, we head to the polls. Was today enough to maintain Labour's 20-point lead? Later, we'll look again with our data and economics editor at the figures underpinning the manifesto and hear what a former Labour advisor made of a launch that could most charitably be described as quietly ambitious. But let's begin in Manchester with our political correspondent, Serena Barker-Singh. Serena, tell us about the day.
There was lots of buzz about the place. They've obviously chosen a huge venue. They feel very confident. They feel very excited. They had one heckler, but I think they quite like that to draw a comparison from what they say is the old party, that climate change activist only work to bolster their brand of a changed party.
We should say that they are breaking down the set, as they say, behind you as we speak, which accounts for some of the noise. Don't worry, we will battle through it, Serena. Let's talk then about the manifesto, the policies. 5 missions, according to Labour: the economy, education, health, energy and crime. And we of course heard from Sir Keir Starmer that this was a mission-driven government. But, I mean, I've had a look through the manifesto, Serena. I'm struggling to find anything that's new.
Well, yes, that is true. Their rebuttal to that is that they don't want any gimmicks. They don't want to promise anything that they can't afford or they can't deliver. So that's why there's nothing new. They've front-loaded it with things like security, secure borders, economic stability. These are all sort of Tory messages historically. And then all of the Labour stuff, or traditional Labour stuff, you'd have thought is in the back. So I think today was less about policy, and that's probably why you're not seeing anything new. This was about cementing a rebrand for the Labour Party, essentially.
Well, let's talk taxation, because whenever there is a general election, one of the dividing lines, or at least one of the dividing lines that the Conservative Party would like us to believe in, is that Labour is a tax and spend party. Now, from Sir Keir, we had it explicitly that there would be no tax rises on the workers, no income tax rises, there'll be no increases to national insurance. But I suppose that when you outline something like that, that does rather lead to questions about every other aspect of tax and whether or not you're going to be raising them.
In fact, what they've said is this manifesto is a total rejection of tax and spend. So it's almost like they don't really want to play that argument that they say the Tories peddles of that manifestos are talking only in the terms of tax and spend. I think what is interesting, though, is they've lent heavily into this idea of growth. They said that they are going to grow the economy in the first year, so much so that public services won't be cut substantially. And I think growth is hard to predict. Independent forecasters like the IFS saying that growth will have to be miraculous in order for difficult choices not to be made.
Why has Sir Keir Starmer felt it necessary to be so explicit on the tax point?
I was thinking, why have we and him been talking about tax this whole time? I think it was quite a pivotal moment, the ITV debate, where Rishi Sunak came quite hard and fast out of the blocks with this central allegation that Labour will be putting up tax by £2,000, and a number that is disputed now by the civil service. But it seems like from then on, they'd been on the back foot and they'd had to rebut that. So they were slightly talking about it in a defensive mode. I think now they're on the attack. Now this is when they're talking about growth and trying to lean away from that.
You have been following this Labour campaign. They are significantly ahead in the polls. Do you get any sign of complacency from Sir Keir, or indeed any of those that surround him?
Certainly today, the mood is one of excitement, less nervous energy, they're being less cautious with their strategies. So I can I can sense that's where it's moving. A lot of the questions today actually from journalists were about complacency and whether the manifesto was in light of that, light on policy. They don't really have to try. I don't think they answered that fully, but there's definitely been a shift that you can sort of feel when you're in the room, that they are feeling like they're on much more comfortable ground.
Serena, good luck with the rest of it. Thanks very much for your time. Big day for Labour figures, past and present. Let's not forget, they haven't had a sniff of power for the best part of 15 years. John McTernan is a political strategist and commentator, and formerly political secretary to Tony Blair. Let's talk about the optics of this with your former Labour advisor hat on. I mean, the manifesto itself, a very stark black and white photo of Sir Keir, sleeves rolled up, as indeed he was at the launch today. Does this sort of stuff matter? I understand the image that he's trying to portray, ready to get on with the job at hand, no nonsense, so on and so forth. But do people actually care?
People only care when you get it wrong. That's the thing about manifestos. Your manifesto really only costs you a problem when, as with Theresa May, you put something in there and people go, isn't that a dementia tax? And then suddenly it's a row because you've had a mess up. You make a gaffe, people talk about your manifesto forever. You have a clean, smooth launch, people forget about it tomorrow. And I think that's how it should be back to the campaign trail.
This was, of course, and it was pretty heavily trailed as such. We weren't surprised that there were no surprises in it. But there were no new promises. Everything that was in this manifesto had been alluded to or stated explicitly before. And Beth Rigby indeed asked of Sir Keir, when you're 20 points ahead in the poll, does that not speak to a lack of ambition? Or perhaps even just a sense that the man who purports to be the next Prime Minister is still a bit fearful about the fact that he might just get the keys to number 10?
No, I think it's the obvious, actually. That if you're saying you are the change, it's your duty to present to the country a worked out programme of change and not to spring surprise on them at the last minute. And I think what people want is stability. Instead of 5 Prime Ministers over 6 years and change the plans with each Prime Minister, we'll have one Prime Minister for 5 years and this is his plan. That's what really, the difference between Jeremy Corbyn in 2019 and 2017. 2017 manifesto, which Labour did well on, surprisingly well on, I think, to most commentators. 2019 did disastrously badly. Because during that campaign, Jeremy Corbyn was spending money like a drunken sailor on shore leave. And there's a bit of that feel to me about the Sunak campaign. Labour as an opposition seeking government have to reassure, and they have to say, look, it's a plan. Do you know why you know it's a plan? Because you've seen all of it before. And you've been able to kick the tires. You've been able to test it. You've been able to raise your objections. This has gone through the public debate and now is put together. I think it would suggest that you are not certain of your votes or your voters or your ideas if you brought out some big new idea.
I understand the safety first approach, but don't people also need to be inspired? And it's not as if, Labour themselves have not been changing things when it came to what ultimately ended up in this document. I mean, take the £28 billion of infrastructure investment that was once a Labour policy that got pretty quickly dropped. So there have been changes. Looking at what was on offer today in this manifesto, is there enough there for those who want to be inspired by a politician? I get it, it's all about winning elections at the end of the day. Fine, totally understand that.
Labour has to inspire, yes. And there's a lot in there that's inspirational. There's £9 billion going to be spent capitalising a government-owned energy company. There's £7.3 billion for a national wealth fund, which will intervene to develop green energy and clean steel, all parts of the industrial strategy. There's a commitment to nationalise the railways. These are big changes for people. Trust in politics has fallen because people have made big, bold claims. Big, bold claims aren't delivered. All politicians and all politics and all trust in politics. You rebuild trust in politics by saying, this is what this policy idea means for you.
What then do you make of the fact, and we've had, again, this was pretty heavily trailed, Keir Starmer ruling out any tax rises on working people? I ask this question for 2 reasons. First, as you and I both know, Labour agreeing to freezing the income tax thresholds means, the amount that is paid in income tax will be rising. But more than that, if there are no tax rises over the course of the next Parliament, there will have to be public sector spending cuts. And on that, the manifesto does not provide clarity.
I mean, I agree with the answer that Keir gave in his Q&A, which is Politics with the Tories has been structured around the notion that there's tax and there's spend and there's no other lever. I understand why they talk like that, because they have had their foot on growth in the UK economy for 15 years. Where, Japan only had one lost decade of growth. We've had one lost decade. We're nearly halfway through the second lost decade. So the important thing to say is growth does matter and growth does create more tax revenue, but the balance of taxation is probably wrong. The balance of taxation between capital and labour has gone wrong. People are taxed too much. So you do have to find a way to decrease tax on labour, and you do have to find other ways to generate the growth. So you can't just keep on saying, do you know what? Stick another penny on national insurance, stick another penny on income tax. That is not right if your workforce, however fast it's growing, has to bear all the burden of it.
John, final question. As Sir Keir Starmer drives away from the manifesto launch, has he got this in the bag? Is there a way in which Labour could lose?
There's always a way to lose. And the Labour Party historically has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. We've got to have the discipline. One of my close friends as an MP said, look, John, you need to understand, every 4 or 5 years, I take my CV and I put it around my entire constituency and I have to get re-employed. There's something existential about elections, which is their greatness, which is nobody can be certain until the polls actually close. Because until you cast your vote, it's not decided.
John, thank you. Stay where you are. After the break, Ed Conway's back. Welcome back. Now, for every manifesto launch we have covered this week, we of course have been focusing rather heavily on the policy, but also the costings, the figures that underpin the promises our politicians make. Now, our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has already expressed a degree of frustration at this task on the podcast this week, but we have managed to persuade him to return to do it one more time. Ed, Labour manifesto, what did you make of it? First thoughts?
Yeah, it is frustrating, but it's worth the effort of kind of starting to look at the numbers, because that's like the best way you can kind of clear away all of the rhetoric about what people actually mean. Like there's a conversation we can get onto about whether the numbers are actually realistic, but it gives you an ability to compare the different manifestos in terms of their scale. And the most striking thing about the Labour manifesto is how piddling some of these numbers are. It's a tiddler. It's a tiddler of a manifesto. When you're looking at the actual kind of figures, you're talking about kind of single figure billions, which when you compare it to the kind of the much bigger numbers that we've heard about for the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, is striking. I guess it's not surprising. And I guess when you think about it, it's consistent with the message we've been getting from Labour quite a lot, which is that, it's about stability, it's about no big unfunded changes. Then it's consistent with that. But definitely it is constrained. There is a bit of extra spending, a bit of extra borrowing, a bit of extra tax rises, but none of these are mammoth figures by any stretch.
So fair to describe this manifesto launch today as safety first, perhaps?
It's massively safety first. That really comes across when you look at the figures. I'll give you an example. Okay, so in the Conservative manifesto, they talk about the kind of envelope, so the amounts they are talking about in terms of how they want to do their tax cuts, because it's mostly tax cuts when it comes to the Conservatives. The total is about 16 billion. Okay, the Lib Dems, when they did theirs, the total was kind of getting on for 30 billion, so 27 billion or so. So 27 billion, 16 billion. The total for the Labour Party is about 5 billion, maybe kind of 9 billion when you're kind of taking into account some of the taxes they want to raise. But basically, it's much smaller. It's Conservative with a small c in a way that the Conservative in a large C manifesto is not. There's a very legitimate question about whether that's going to give them enough firepower if they want to actually make meaningful changes to the economy in the future, which I think, one should be having. To the extent that I think if he were to do something that was much bigger than this, then I think people can legitimately look and say, well, listen, we voted for a manifesto that was unrecognisably different to what you're doing.
Well, here was me thinking, given that Labour politicians have been repeating this mantra for the past decade or so, that they couldn't come up with specific costings for certain things until they'd gotten into Whitehall and had a chance to check under the bonnet and look at the figures.
But that's the other thing, isn't it? They've still got that option of getting in and saying, oh, it turns out it's much worse than we thought it was. And I'm sure there'll be a bunch of that, if they were to win.
But just in terms of the spending, the additional spending that we've seen as a result of this manifesto document, the additional taxation that is coming in, again, it's always back of a fag packet stuff. You've seen graphs with 3 columns in the Conservative manifesto. There's a few more columns in the Labour manifesto, but again, it's all very simple mathematics involved here. Does it work out?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were being spun one story by kind of Labour this morning, which is not quite right. So they were saying, look at our numbers. We're so prudent. We're raising £7.4 billion in taxes, and we are planning to spend £4.8 billion. And lo and behold, if you take one away from the other, then you end up with £2.5 billion of kind of caution, a buffer, which we have never seen, in any of the other manifestos. Conservatives say they want to spend £16 billion on tax cuts, and miraculously so appear £16 billion of revenues that come in from the various things that no one's quite sure that they can actually raise. With the Labour Party, you don't get that. So in that sense, it is actually more cautious. But then dig a bit deeper and look at things like the Energy Green Prosperity Plan, as it's called. It's the kind of the son of the 28 billion thing, which is much smaller. When you tack that on, you've got a little bit more in taxes, but you've also got quite a lot more in spending on investment. And all told, you're talking about this not having a buffer. Quite the opposite. Is actually involves about £1 billion of extra borrowing. Now, you can make the point that most of that borrowing is borrowing to invest, okay? And I think that's a very reasonable point to make, because it is borrowing to invest rather than borrowing to splurge on stuff that you're spending on every year. But even so, it's interesting. It's a little bit of spin.
But aren't there some pretty big assumptions being made about growth and immediate growth for Labour's manifesto to stack up?
They are hoping for growth, but what they're not doing, and I think this is quite important, they're hoping for growth, and they say that, if and when they get that growth, there will be more money to spend on stuff. What they're not doing is saying, we're certain there's going to be growth, and as a result, we're giving you loads of money. We're kind of giving you a down payment on that growth. Okay, that would be the suspect thing. In a sense, that's kind of the Liz Truss model, which is like, I'm pretty sure we can grow the economy. I'm going to give you a tax cut right now. Labour actually don't do that in this, but there is a kind of an assumption that if they get growth, then there'll be lots more money to spend.
Yeah, what they have done, however, is exactly what the Conservatives have done and said, we're not going to raise national insurance, we're not going to raise income tax, we're not going to put VAT on things. Yeah,
the conspiracy of silence, as it's become known, and I think that's kind of a fair way of putting it. They are as silent as the rest of the parties, apart from maybe the Green Party, who are very happy to spend as much money as one could imagine by raising taxes to unprecedented levels. All the other parties are basically not confronting the fact that baked into the public finances right now is an assumption of more austerity.
Let's conclude on a topic that we have covered on every other manifesto that we've discussed. It is the tax burden. And we, of course, at the Sky Leaders event last night saw Rishi Sunak challenging again the idea that people were going to view the Conservatives as anything other than a tax-raising party. He, of course, would like to see them viewed as a tax-cutting party. But we know, of course, despite their proposed national insurance cuts, the overall tax burden is still going to go up. You've crunched the numbers for Labour. What's the story when it comes to them?
The answer when it comes to Labour is that taxes on the basis of this manifesto would go up ever so slightly faster than the current plan from the government.
This could be the dividing line of the election, Ed.
Well, they are worse. And this is no bad thing that it's not just rhetoric. We actually have numbers on the chart here that show you, and you can see it on our website and in our coverage. We have numbers on a chart that basically show you right now the current plan is tax burden going up at a reasonably fast pace. Under the Conservatives, it still goes up, but slower. Under Labour, it goes up, but a little bit faster than that current plan. Under the Lib Dems, it goes up even faster. And under the Green Party, it's like the vertical line that ends up at Sweden. So I don't think anyone can shirk away from the fact that we will be paying more taxes under this Labour manifesto. In fact, it would be just about the highest that we've had in modern history, so going back even higher than in 1948. That being said, it's not a massive difference to the current plan. So it's not like a stark difference. And actually, when you look at the Labour line, it's kind of basically where the Tories were before they started cutting national insurance, actually. This is the kind of a good thing about the point that we're in at the moment is that now we have enough information that we can draw this comparison between the different parties and say this is what one of them stands for, this is what the other one stands for, with the massive proviso that we don't know that they'll necessarily actually stick to their word. If they're going to break promises, then at least we have it in black and white that this was not necessarily what they were kind of heading for. And that goes for all the parties.
Indeed. And when it happens, we'll invite you back on the podcast and you can tell us all about it.
Love to.
Good to see you, mate. Thanks again. We had been briefed heavily not to expect any surprises. No rabbits from hats. Absolutely no bombshells, tax or otherwise. And so it proved. Jacket off, sleeves rolled up, Sir Keir Starmer certainly wanted to give the impression that he's ready to get to work, that Labour is the change the country requires. Some will say the manifesto displays a lack of ambition. After Labour's 14 years in opposition, Sir Keir would say surely getting into Downing Street is ambition enough. That's a lot for this edition of The Daily. Back again tomorrow.